For years, there was one voice missing from the story everyone thought they already knew. Rob Reiner was everywhere. Interviews, politics, Hollywood retrospectives. Penny Marshall was remembered as a legend, celebrated after her death with tributes that painted her as endlessly lovable, fearless, and groundbreaking. Their names were dissected, praised, criticized, and preserved in pop culture history. But their daughter stayed quiet. No dramatic interviews. No tell-all books. No public corrections. Just silence. And that silence became louder after Penny Marshall's death in 2018. Because when someone dies, stories tend to harden. Narratives become fixed. The public decides who a person was, what they stood for, and how their family must have felt. In the months and years after Penny's passing, the world mourned an icon. But few stopped to wonder how it felt for the child who grew up watching two larger-than-life personalities navigate fame, love, separation, and legacy. Tracy Reiner wasn't just Rob Reiner's daughter or Penny Marshall's child. She was the one living inside the spaces between those headlines. Friends noticed she didn't rush to speak. She didn't correct the myths or amplify the praise. And in Hollywood, where silence is often interpreted as distance, people began to speculate. Was she protecting something, avoiding something, or simply waiting? Then, years later, she finally spoke, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a calm honesty that reframed everything people thought they understood. What she said didn't tear anyone down. It didn't rewrite history, but it did something far more unsettling. It reminded people that public legends are private parents first. She spoke about grief that didn't arrive all at once, about losing a mother the world felt entitled to, while trying to grieve in a way that didn't belong to anyone else, about a father who was present in the public eye, but whose role at home had its own quiet complexities. Most importantly, she addressed the strange burden of inheriting a story already told by millions of strangers. Because when your parents are famous, your memories don't belong only to you. They belong to fans, journalists, documentaries, and nostalgia. And after death, those memories become even harder to protect. Her decision to finally break the silence wasn't impulsive. It came after years of reflection, distance, and healing. And when she did speak, it wasn't to chase attention. It was to reclaim something deeply personal. But to understand why her words carried so much weight, you have to understand the world she grew up in, a world shaped by two Hollywood powerhouses long before she ever had a choice. And that story begins long before the fame, the divorce, or the loss that would eventually bring everything into sharper focus. Tracy Reiner was born into a world where last names opened doors before she ever knocked. Rob Reiner wasn't just another actor. He was television royalty, the son of Carl Reiner, carrying a legacy that already shaped American comedy. Penny Marshall was rising fast, magnetic and unstoppable, carving out her own place in an industry that rarely made room for women like her. Together, they looked like a Hollywood fairy tale from the outside. Inside the house, it felt very different. Tracy was adopted as an infant, something her parents never hid from her. In fact, they treated it as something sacred. Penny, especially, made sure Tracy understood she was chosen, not accidental. But being chosen by two people constantly pulled in different directions by fame came with its own quiet complications. Dinner tables weren't always predictable. Schedules changed. Sets replaced routines. Conversations stopped and started again days later. Tracy learned early that love didn't always look calm or consistent, even when it was genuine. When Rob and Penny divorced in 1981, Tracy was still young enough to feel the shift, but old enough to remember the before and after. One household became two. The energy changed. The tension didn't explode, it dissolved. And that kind of separation can be more confusing than loud conflict. There were no public scandals. No ugly tabloid wars. Just two ambitious people realizing they worked better apart than together. For Tracy, that meant learning how to exist in the space between them. She watched her mother become a powerhouse director, breaking barriers with films that defined entire generations. She watched her father evolve into a filmmaker with strong political opinions and a public voice that grew louder over time. And through it all, she remained the constant, the one thing they both agreed mattered most. But even love has limits when careers demand everything. Tracy has spoken about how fame distorted normal childhood markers. School events felt different when other parents recognized her last name. Friends didn't always see her as just Tracy. She learned early how to read rooms, how to shrink when attention grew uncomfortable, how to listen more than speak. She wasn't pushed into acting. No one forced a career path on her. In fact, she resisted Hollywood for years, choosing work behind the scenes, production roles, anything that let her stay close without being consumed. That choice alone said a lot. Because when you grow up watching fame up close, you learn what it takes, and what it takes from you. Rob and Penny loved her fiercely, but they were also human. Busy, flawed, exhausted, and Tracy absorbed all of it quietly, storing away observations she wouldn't share publicly for decades. The world saw icons being built in real time. She saw parents figuring things out as they went. And that difference between who they were to everyone else and who they were to her would become the emotional fault line that made her eventual silence make sense. Because when you know the full picture, speaking too soon can feel like a betrayal. And when loss finally arrives, that line between public memory and private truth becomes impossible to ignore. From the outside, Rob Reiner and Penny Marshall looked like two people who moved on cleanly. They co-parented without public drama. They praised each other professionally. They showed up to events with smiles that reassured the world everything was fine. And for the most part, it was. But what cameras don't capture is emotional residue. Inside their family, there were conversations that never became quotes. Moments that never made headlines. Long stretches where Tracy learned to adapt instead of complain. She has since acknowledged that her parents' separation didn't damage her in obvious ways. There was no explosive trauma, no chaos. And yet, there was something quieter, a constant recalibration. Learning which version of her parents she would get on which day. Learning how to be flexible when adults were tired, distracted, or overwhelmed. Penny Marshall, in particular, was a force of nature. Brilliant, funny, deeply loving, but also stubborn, emotionally guarded, and always moving forward. Tracy has hinted that her mother didn't always slow down long enough to process feelings in real time. Work became both passion and escape. Success filled space that grief and uncertainty might have otherwise occupied. Rob Reiner was different. More verbal, more openly reflective, more willing to engage publicly with ideas, politics, and emotion. That difference created balance, but it also created distance. Tracy often found herself translating emotional languages between two people who loved her but expressed it in very different ways. And that's where the Real story lived. Not in arguments, but in absences. Not in anger, but in things left unsaid. As Tracy grew older, she began to understand that her parents weren't withholding love. They were navigating lives that had been shaped by ambition, pressure, and expectations long before she arrived. That realization didn't erase the weight she carried, but it gave it context. Still, context doesn't cancel impact. There were moments she wished for anonymity, for normalcy, for parents who could attend events without being recognized, for grief that didn't belong to the public. Those feelings didn't make her ungrateful. They made her human. And for a long time, she believed those thoughts were hers alone to carry. That's why her silence after Penny Marshall's death felt intentional. She wasn't avoiding the truth. She was protecting it. Because when the world mourned Penny, they mourned a symbol, a pioneer, a cultural touchstone. Tracy mourned a mother whose flaws were inseparable from her love. A woman who gave her everything she could, even when she didn't always know how to give more. The cameras never captured those contradictions, and Tracy didn't correct them, until grief itself began to change shape. Because loss doesn't stay frozen in time. It evolves. And eventually, it demands expression, not for the audience, but for the person carrying it. And when that moment arrived, Tracy realized staying silent no longer served the truth she had spent a lifetime holding. When Penny Marshall died, the world reacted instantly. Tributes flooded in. Co-stars shared stories. Directors credited her for opening doors that had once been locked tight. Her name trended. Her legacy was sealed almost overnight, wrapped in warmth and admiration. For Tracy, the experience was disorienting. Grief didn't arrive as a single wave. It came in fragments. In private moments that clashed with the public celebration. In the strange realization that her mother no longer belonged to her alone, not even in death. She has described how mourning felt delayed, interrupted by responsibility and restraint. Every statement carried weight. Every silence invited interpretation. Saying nothing felt safer than saying something wrong. But grief has a way of surfacing when defenses weaken. As time passed, Tracy began noticing the subtle ways loss reshaped her relationship with her father. Rob Reiner was still very much alive, still active, still public. And suddenly, the contrast between presence and absence felt sharper than ever. Losing one parent changes how you see the other. Conversations took on new meaning. Memories resurfaced with different emotional colors. Moments once dismissed as ordinary felt precious in hindsight. Tracy found herself reevaluating childhood experiences not with judgment, but with empathy. She saw her parents not as icons, not as cautionary tales, but as two people doing their best with the tools they had. And that realization hurt more than resentment ever could, because understanding doesn't undo loss. It deepens it. At some point, Tracy recognized that staying silent wasn't protecting her family anymore. It was protecting the public from complexity. And complexity was exactly what the story needed. When she finally spoke, she didn't frame her words as revelations. There were no accusations, no corrections, just context. She spoke about love that was imperfect but real. About a mother who showed affection through action more than words. About a father who expressed care differently, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes openly. Most importantly, she spoke about how death freezes people in the version the world prefers, not the one their family lived with. Breaking her silence wasn't about rewriting Penny Marshall's legacy. It was about reclaiming the right to remember her fully. And in doing so, Tracy acknowledged something many people never say out loud. That grief doesn't need an audience. But truth sometimes does. Her words didn't close the chapter. They opened a deeper one. One that shifted the focus away from fame and toward humanity. And as people listened, something unexpected happened. They didn't turn away. They leaned in. Because what Tracy shared wasn't just about her parents. It was about how we all struggle to reconcile who people were to us versus who they were to the world. And that realization set the stage for why speaking now, after so many years, mattered more than ever. Time changes what silence means. In the years immediately following loss, silence can be survival. A way to breathe. A way to grieve without being pulled apart by expectations. But as distance grows, silence begins to sound different. Less like protection, more like absence. That's the space Tracy Reiner eventually found herself in. Her parents' stories had been told and retold without her voice. Not maliciously, not inaccurately, just incompletely. And the longer she waited, the more she realized that the missing piece wasn't scandal or contradiction. It was nuance. Speaking now wasn't about correcting the past. It was about allowing the present to exist honestly. Tracy understood something most celebrity children learn too late. If you don't define your own truth, someone else will simplify it for you. So when she chose to speak, she did it carefully, deliberately, without spectacle. She acknowledged the love she received. She acknowledged the gaps. She allowed her parents to be brilliant and flawed in the same breath. And in doing so, she gave the public permission to see them not as monuments, but as people. That matters more than it seems. Because celebrity culture thrives on extremes. Heroes or villains. Success or failure. Perfect parents or damaged ones. Tracy's voice disrupted that pattern. It reminded people that most families exist somewhere in the middle, quietly adapting, quietly loving, quietly struggling. Her timing wasn't accidental. By waiting, she ensured her words wouldn't compete with mourning or legacy building. She spoke when emotions had cooled enough for reflection to land, when listening became possible. And perhaps most importantly, she spoke not as a daughter seeking validation, but as an adult at peace with complexity. That's why her message resonated. Not because it was shocking, because it was grounded. In a culture obsessed with instant reactions, her restraint felt almost radical. It showed that silence isn't weakness, and that speaking later doesn't mean speaking too late. For Tracy, breaking her silence wasn't an ending. It was a boundary, a way of saying that her story exists alongside the public one, not beneath it. And for anyone watching, listening, or recognizing pieces of their own family in hers, that might be the most powerful legacy of all. Because fame fades, headlines disappear, but the way we remember the people we loved, fully, imperfectly, honestly, is what lasts. Ready to publish.